I'm Peter Stallybrass, co-director with Wendy Steiner of the Penn Humanities Forum. And today we're here to celebrate both the 30th anniversary of Benjamin Franklin's birth and the continuing existence of one of the many institutions that he was involved in founding, the University of Pennsylvania. This symposium, if Ben had his way, is co-sponsored by the Marvin and Sybil Weiner Fund of Van Pelt Library, Michael Ryan and Special Collections of the Library, and the Penn Humanities Forum. And I particularly want to thank Marvin and Sybil Weiner for their generous support, both in making this event possible and for the prize for the award-winning undergraduates whom we are celebrating today. I'm delighted that Herb and Sheila Weiner can be with us today. Benjamin Franklin was one of the founding trustees of the Academy in Philadelphia, which was later to become the University of Pennsylvania. In creating the school's charter, he insisted that the Academy train students in English grammar and oratory, a revolutionary move given that contemporary colleges emphasized only the classical languages, which were largely taught to young men who were preparing to enter the church. In fact, as a teenager, writing in the voice of an old widow, Silence Dogood, Franklin poured scorn on Harvard as, quote, a temple of theology, where the students, quote, learn little more than how to carry themselves handsomely and enter a room genteelly, which might well be acquired at a dancing school, and from which they return after abundance of trouble and charge, as great blockheads as ever, only more proud and self-conceited. In other words, Franklin didn't have a very high regard for the institutions of higher education, to which he'd been denied access because of the poverty of his family. He wasn't, as is sometimes thought, against the teaching of classics. To the contrary, what he objected to was that a small elite had made sure that, quote from Franklin again, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, etc., were very much reserved and seldom or never unveiled their faces. He did believe, however, that education should be in the vernacular language, and that one should then learn modern languages and only finally the classical languages. In this, he attacked the very roots of what was a gentlemanly preserve. In 1748, the year that Franklin gave up active work as a printer, Lord Chesterfield wrote that, quote, the word illiterate in its common acceptation means a man who is ignorant of Greek and Latin. In other words, Benjamin Franklin, the greatest American writer of the 18th century and the most important colonial printer and publisher of his day, was, according to Chesterfield, illiterate. Franklin was central in redefining what literacy in the sciences as much as the arts would come to mean in the future, and in erasing the contempt in which the languages of everyday life were so often held. Education, Franklin argued, should cultivate a person's thought and expression and provide knowledge of practical subjects such as mathematics, geography, history, logic, and moral philosophy. With this background, one could become an effective citizen to serve mankind, one's country, friends, and family, which ability should be the great aim and end of all learning. But near the end of his life, Franklin concluded that the Academy had consistently violated its charter, slighting English in favour of Latin instruction, and he demanded that the English section of the school break away. Claiming an actual partition of our joint stock, he wished to execute the plan they had so long defeated and afford the public the means of a complete English education. Though this demand was not met, in time English did replace Latin and Greek as a language of instruction in American and British universities, and the curriculum came to include the full panoply of disciplines. In other words, even though Ben did not have his way, time brought about the kind of institution he had envisaged. Or did it? Franklin was advocating much more than the choice of one language or discipline over others. He was advancing a controversial view of the university's relation to tradition, class, citizenship, and speculative knowledge. We will be discussing today the extent to which higher education, and Penn in particular, has fulfilled Franklin's vision. At the end of the symposium, you're all warmly invited to a reception in the Rosenwald Gallery on the 6th floor of the library. This will also give you the chance to see, if you haven't already, the wonderful exhibition that John Pollock and Andrea Gottschall have organised on educating the youth of Pennsylvania, worlds of learning in the age of Franklin. It's quite a remarkable exhibition. They've brought together material from no one even knew existed. I didn't know it existed. From schools in the region, from all sorts of places, as well as from our own collections and elsewhere. It's now my great pleasure to award the prizes for the best undergraduate essays on the topic of If Penn Had His Way. The first prize is awarded to Tal Raviv, whose essay Spark was the unanimous choice of the three judges, Max Kavich, Christopher Hunter, and myself. We chose Tal's essay for its wonderfully detailed accounts of Linus Pauling and Ashok Gadgil, and for Tal's justification of a multidisciplinary training as a key to invention. We were particularly impressed that, like Franklin, Tal showed such wide-ranging interest in everything from chemical engineering to anthropology to art history to medicine to fishing. We only found out the names and disciplines of the contestants after we had all agreed on the prize winners. All the essays were submitted anonymously under pseudonyms. The great Franklin tradition, of course. It was then that we discovered that Tal majors in chemical engineering in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. And we're delighted that Eduardo Blunt, the dean of the school, is with us today. That a scientist has submitted the winning essay confirms Franklin's deep commitment to bringing together skills that are so often and wrongly believed to be the separate preserves of the arts and the sciences. Please join me in congratulating Tal Raviv with the prize of $1,000. The runners-up were Gina Katz for Franklin's Ivy League and the Junto of Education, and Dvorak Mausner for If Ben Had His Way of Virtue, Wit, and Wisdom. Gina majors in English and Dvorak in the biological basis of behavior. The judges were particularly impressed by Gina's detailed engagement with Franklin's proposals and with the way she brought together Franklin and Walt Whitman. We also enjoyed her critique of Penn's present living arrangements and her account of how errata function as a crucial part of education. Dvorak wrote a fine defense of free press, of tolerance, and of intellectual openness. And we also enjoyed her witty account of Penn's famous humility. Please join me in congratulating Gina and Dvorak, who each gave $500. It's my pleasure to ask Tal to deliver the winning essay, Spark. It's a shortened version of it. And this will be followed by a response from Christopher Hunter, who's a graduate student in comparative literature, and I can say a great expert on Benjamin Franklin, both here and in Paris. So he deals with both sides of the Atlantic. Okay, Tal.
I have a slight problem. I just realized that my cell phone is in my pocket and it's on. And I have to figure out a smooth way of turning it off while I'm up here. So I'm going to ask all of you to please turn off your cell phones. And thank you very much. All right. At the age of 9, young Linus had made up his mind to be a chemical engineer. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, he was fascinated by the natural world and devoured books with a natural appetite. Linus excelled at school, especially impressing his chemistry teacher, who awarded him an extra semester of credit for his work. By the fall of 1916, the 15-year-old senior was already prepared to graduate from high school. Linus had all the necessary credits except for 2 history courses. Nevertheless, that September, he decided that he was uninterested in American History 1 and 2 and left the school without a diploma. Still eligible to enroll, Linus resolved to enroll in college. Linus resolved to take as many mathematics courses as possible and to major in chemical engineering. Back home, his mother envisioned a different future for her son. She firmly opposed higher education. To her, college was effete and strange. In her mind, a real man was self-taught, as the men in her family had been. she insisted that Linus work at a local machine shop and start bringing home regular wages. Sensing that his life's goal was threatened, Linus disobeyed his mother and enrolled in the Oregon Agricultural College at the age of 16. There, he won the support of nearly all the faculty he met. After graduating, he immediately continued his education to earn his PhD from Caltech. 73 years and 2 Nobel Prizes later, Professor Linus Pauling was world-renowned for his contributions to the fields of organic chemistry, molecular biology, and medicine. In a 1990 interview, he said the following, a quote which I would find on the first page of my first chemical engineering textbook. "Why?" he asked, referring to his earth-shattering contributions to fields in which he had never taken courses. "Why am I able to do these things? You see, I got such a good basic education in the fields where it is difficult for most people to learn by themselves." It's tempting to interpret Ben Franklin's vision for multidisciplinary education as a curriculum of quantity. Adding more departments and requiring the study of far more varied subjects is what, on the surface, he mainly announces in proposals relating to the education of youth in Pennsylvania. On first pass, the document seems unremarkable. One would be hard-pressed to find an American university today without an English department. Even MIT has a major in literature. Or a science class without a laboratory component. Students who might major in physics are still exposed to courses in writing, history, and foreign languages. General requirements ensure that students learn, as British educator Thomas Huxley wrote, something about everything and everything about something. At least today, Franklin's ideas for a multidisciplinary education are widely adopted, and it seems that his vision has been achieved. Or has it? Is it true that an education needs only to be diverse to be of quality? Is a university which provides its students with courses in both the arts and sciences doing enough to prepare them for their most effective citizenship? Perhaps Benjamin Franklin's proposal for America's first university implies teaching youth something more. In the fall of 1973, Ashok Gadgil arrived at the University of California at Berkeley to enroll in the physics PhD program. After completing both his bachelor's and master's degrees in India, Gadgil was in for a shock and a reaffirmation of purpose when he arrived in the United States. 2 things really struck me while I was in graduate school, he said. One was the high level of affluence in the United States. The second thing was getting a sense of how important it is to have science applied to address problems that are societally significant. They may not be scientifically significant because the basic science is well understood, but nobody had bothered to take that final step to convert that into a useful technology. In the 1990s, Gadgil began investigating the use of ultraviolet radiation in killing bacteria and viruses. The motivation for his work came from his first-hand knowledge of epidemics. While living in India, Gadgil found himself in the midst of a drinking water hepatitis infection which affected many of his friends and neighbors. Gadgil was familiar with the global problem of diseases spreading through public drinking water, one of the most rapid and lethal modes of disease propagation. In 1993, after a cholera outbreak in Bangladesh resulted in over 10,000 deaths, he resolved to apply his knowledge of physics and engineering to a problem which was sociological, civic, and medical in nature. That summer, together with a student, Professor Gadgil found a certain wavelength of UV light that could potentially disinfect water at half a cent per ton. Since then, Gadgil's UV waterworks system and scaled variations of the original invention have saved countless lives. The new application has improved the quality of life in countries ranging from Honduras to the Philippines, and his technology continues to be one of today's most important tools in cleansing drinking water for large populations. What is Gadgil's greatest contribution? As far back as the 19th century, UV light was known by scientists to kill bacteria, and for centuries, public drinking water systems had suffered from infection? If so, why did it take until the arrival of Ashok Gadgil to consolidate the two into what is a technologically simple invention? Understanding Professor Gadgil's story makes the answer clear. A strong education in the hard sciences, a first-hand understanding of world health problems, and a moral conscience led to his role in pioneering effective and economically persuasive water purification. Ashok Gadgil's total education was more than a product of his schooling, but his success reveals a valuable lesson for formal education. Gadgil's multidisciplinary exposure, plus a spark to integrate widely separate sections of his knowledge, made him a worldwide lifesaver. That spark, the inventor's spark, can be taught in school. And that spark is the key to Franklin's vision. Released in it are what I believe to be the final necessary parameters to a multidisciplinary education with a relationship to the world. Stroll along Walnut Street, near 36th today, and you'll pass a large window display in the Penn bookstore. Aside from the Franklin-faced mannequins sporting overpriced Penn sweatshirts, a large portrait of Ben Franklin hangs, staring forward at the Annenberg Center. Surrounding the portrait in large print are the many classifications one might use for Franklin's life. Among the terms in the display are diplomat, scientist, writer, publisher, electrician. To the left is the word which I believe is the most central of all to Franklin's personality and vision for education. Aside from his huge role in our nation's history, the Penn bookstore reminds us, Ben Franklin was also an inventor. What is invention? Many might flatly answer with the child of necessity. Certainly, most inventions respond to a need, but a need will not necessarily inspire innovation. Inventing requires knowledge of the world and its properties, and an attitude that it should be challenged and can be changed. Attitude is the key ingredient, not genius or brilliance. Albert Einstein spent his college years around books and meetings about the philosophy of science. His observations of the pattern of history gave him the insight that nothing is sacred in scientific knowledge. When his mind rolled around to the experimental inconsistency surrounding the 19th century theory of light, he was more inclined to overhaul the conventional theory than to scramble to explain it. Richard Feynman, another Nobel Prize-winning physicist, famous for his irreverent attitude, wrote, "Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts." The two fundamental methods of invention are integration and differentiation. To invent by integration is to combine two or more ideas on any level. That's simple. Most inventions can be attributed to integration. To try naming a few physical inventions, the outboard motor on a boat, the ATM machine, and the city mural are all products of integration. One of many academic ideas attributed to integration might be the computer science of artificial evolution, where natural selection is applied to embryonic circuits until they evolve into something which can perform something as complicated as the cube root of an input. Differentiation feeds on integrative inventions. What if, in creating combinations, an inventor combines too many things? That invention could still be useful and innovative, but was something overlooked? Maybe combining less would have yielded something else. Differentiation is picking apart an existing idea, questioning what we take for granted about something. To invent by differentiating, make a list of the parts, attributes, and assumptions of an idea, delete or replace any one, and put it all back together. Step back and see what you've made. It's bound to be novel, maybe even useful. Many highly effective art movements, such as Impressionism, have evolved this way. Why does painting have to be detailed? The recently publicized $100 laptop project of the MIT Media Laboratory is also a differentiated invention. The object is to create a portable computer with far less ornamental features than what we call an obese personal computer. The hand-crank powered, fully functional laptop will be mass-produced and distributed to students in third world countries to connect them with the massive knowledge network of the World Wide Web. These two methods of invention don't explain all inventions, how the inventors themselves came up with the idea, or how to solve from a problem. Inventors use both processes in many inventions. However, if we can map inventions on these terms, we clearly see what an inventor should know. To integrate, an inventor's knowledge must have breadth and depth. She must know of the problems in other fields. She must understand the different ways of thinking in different fields. She must know, at least, how to start any intellectual excursion in a field besides her own. More than just knowing about other subjects, she must above all appreciate their value and potential in relating to her field. A good anthropologist understands the basics of microeconomics, and a biologist commonly uses statistics. There are many more combinations and reapplications waiting to be made. Furthermore, to integrate, an inventor should also possess a depth of knowledge in a certain field. To identify a worthwhile problem, one must often be at the raw edge of knowledge and understand what has been solved and left unsolved. It took a medical scrub technician like Thomas Fogarty, present at many cardiovascular surgeries, to invent the balloon catheter in 1961. Of course, Fogarty was also a fly fisher and used his skills in that sport to tie together the first prototype. An inventor should be an expert in something. On the other hand, to differentiate, an inventor must know how to laugh at the world. He must have the attitude that nothing is sacred and that everything is worth questioning. He must feel that there is no reason for light switches to be shaped the way they are, that cell phones don't necessarily need to connect to central towers, or that a story does not have to be told in chronological order. The more fundamental the assumptions he challenges, the more significant and disruptive the final idea. Benjamin Franklin, the inventor, proposed a school that would graduate inventors. His multidisciplinary curriculum communicates more than a lot of separate knowledge. It displays the connections between disciplines as explicitly as possible to the students. Franklin strings together seemingly disparate subjects, moving seamlessly from economics to mechanical engineering, sliding from history to oratory. It is clear from the proposal that Franklin's youth would study many different subjects over the course of their education. But multidisciplinary means more than learning many different things. It's about learning what the different fields share. On the surface, there's not much in common between businessmen and journalists. Businessmen create reality out of appearances. Journalists work to restore appearances back to reality, in theory. What they must both do well, however, is communicate their ideas with language. There are few things more glaring from Franklin's proposal and his footnotes than his insistence on teaching language, the English language, and teaching it in all its forms. No professional can escape the need to communicate, and often a person's communication skill can act as a soft link in an entire chain of accomplishments. Writing and speaking are the most efficient ways of communication, and their refinement can only increase the traffic within and between fields. As Ludwig Wittgenstein famously wrote, "The limits of my language in the limits of my world." Did Ben have his way? By this interpretation, we should evaluate whether students receive a multidisciplinary education, if they have sufficiently learned how to think, and whether we encourage the right attitude. Even better, One can open a recent issue of the Pennsylvania Gazette, alumni magazine of Penn, and read the latest alumni profiles, articles on what 5 selected Penn graduates are currently working. But giving examples is definitely futile. I could expound on how Penn is one of the most interdisciplinary institutions in the world. I could mention how few, if any, other universities surpass Penn's quantities of diverse research nodes and the links between them. On the contrary, I can list undergraduate classroom experiences, or complain that the physics department doesn't collaborate enough with the Penn School. Even if we could authoritatively calculate an IBHHHW quotient, if Penn had had its way, say 36.0, it would leave us wondering, what's next? Asking, are we there yet, is not the right question. Asking, where are we going, is better. As a resident of Florida, I can frankly say that building strong walls for a house is one thing. Designing a house to withstand a hurricane is quite another. Likewise, it is far clearer, more flexible, and more focused to describe a university's mission in terms of ends rather than in terms of means. More than specific initiatives such as the Weiss Tech House or the Engineering Wharton Product Design course, the entire educational mission should be invention and problem solving. With invention as the ultimate focus of a Penn education, everything else will fall into place. Thank you.
So as to leave us some time at the end for discussion, I'm going to try and keep my own remarks relatively brief. I do want to say that to find that not only a scientist, but an engineer, future engineer, is the winner of this contest came neither as a surprise to me, nor as an unpleasant one. I think Ben would have been thrilled, as I am, to see that we have the kind of cross-disciplinary work happening that will allow this sort of thing to be possible. So congratulations. I was also thrilled to read about the useful side of fly time, having wasted a lot of time trying to perfect it. But now at least got that to hold on to. So I'm not planning myself on making any gathers anytime soon. One of the things that interested me about this essay was its attempt to grapple with the notion of inspiration, the moment, the spark, the epiphany that comes with all new invention. And oddly enough, for reasons that will become clear in a moment, what it reminded me of was an essay by Max Weber, an essay about a speech that he was giving while Linus Pauling was entering high school. It's called Science as a Vocation, and in it he grapples with the same question of inspiration. Weber writes, "The idea is not a substitute for work, and work in turn cannot substitute for or compel an idea, just as little as enthusiasm can. Both, enthusiasm and work, and above all both of them jointly, can entice an idea. Ideas occur to us when they please, and not when it pleases us. And the best ideas do indeed occur to one's mind in the way in which Ehring describes it. When smoking a cigar on the sofa, or, as Helmholtz states it himself with scientific exactitude, when taking a walk on a slowly ascending street, or in a similar way. In any case," Weber continues, "ideas come when we do not expect them, and not when we are brooding and searching at our desks. Yet ideas would certainly not come to mind had we not brooded at our desks and searched for answers with passionate devotion." One of the things that Franklin noted as important in his own proposal for the establishment of the Academy was the importance of physical exercise. He talks about swimming and running and shooting as important parts of a well-rounded education. Important parts, perhaps precisely because they allow the sort of inspiration, the kind of spark, to appear to us when we least expect it. I think that Weber and Tal and Franklin indeed would agree on the importance of a diverse educational experience to the moment of inspiration, the ineffable moment of inspiration that Tal captures so well in his essay. But another thing also occurred to me, which is that the spark about which Tal writes so well was, for Franklin, also a literal moment of inspiration. It's both a rhetorical figure in your essay and also for him the very stuff and substance of his own scientific work. In fact, Franklin made his money as a printer, but he made his reputation internationally as a scientist. So I will read now from Priestley's account of Franklin's famous kite experiment. The kite being raised, a considerable time elapsed before there was any appearance of its being electrified. One very promising cloud had passed over it, though without any effect. When, at length, just as he was beginning to despair of his contrivance, he observed some of the loose threads of the hempen string to stand erect, and to avoid one another, just as if they had been immediately suspended on a conductor. Struck with this promising appearance, he immediately presented his knuckle to the key, and let the reader judge the exquisite pleasure he must have felt at that moment. The discovery was complete. The reason that's so funny is he perceived a very evident electric spark. That is, and he stuck his knuckle up to the key and got shocked. Thereby, of course, proving that lightning was an electrical phenomenon. Franklin, perhaps not the first to do this experiment, which he had himself proposed. He was beaten by about a month by someone in France. But nevertheless, this discovery of his, this experiment, which he then carried out, or perhaps had his son carry out, catapulted him to scientific fame, made possible his later political achievements, which he achieved on the basis of that fame, and in fact cemented the reputation which we're now very much living of. So this achievement of wresting the lightning from the clouds inspired numerous comparisons by Franklin's contemporaries of him to a modern Prometheus. But wrestling lightning from heaven and scepters from tyrants, at least the first part of that, implies also a shift from the metaphysical or the mythical, from Prometheus to the physical, to the scientist. And it's on that change I would like to conclude. What seems to me of cardinal importance about Franklin's Academy is that, unlike the dancing school of Harvard, it wasn't established to train future divines. Harvard was Congregationalist, William and Mary Anglican, Yale also Congregationalist. The Academy of Philadelphia was not. It was explicitly non-sectarian, if Quaker-dominated, as one might expect. Penn recently has been, in the past century, has attempted to establish an alternate theory of its own founding by situating the beginnings of the university in 1640 with Whitefield's Charity School, which happened to occupy the same building as Franklin's Academy later would. A project of interest, perhaps to Penn alumni, who would have their college be older than Princeton, but also one that fundamentally changes the beginnings. If we are Whitefield School, we are essentially a product of the Great Awakening, rather than a religious revival, rather than Franklin's deistic, some would say atheistic, secular enlightenment. And while Harvard, William and Mary, Princeton, Yale have all followed in the footsteps of Penn and are now secular institutions, it seems to me that the great founding idea behind this university was, in fact, that it is not a religious institution, that it was training people for citizenship and not for ministry, for surveying their fellow men in the here and now, rather than preparing them for the hereafter.
Thank you very much, Tal. Thank you very much, Chris. I wonder how many of you know that Franklin nearly became the first ever professional swimming coach. When he was in London, he was thinking of not returning, and why he was a great swimmer, and many people had observed him swimming, and a whole range of aristocrats asked him to train their children to become great swimmers in his wake. One of the ways he learned how to swim, by the way, was from books. One of the books is a French book which has illustrations of amazing postures that you can do in the water. And Franklin trained himself to do many of these tricks, and he would swim up the Thames with boats following him, people observing him as he swam. Well, I'm now honoured to introduce our distinguished speakers and to thank them for participating in this symposium. Each of them will speak for 5 to 10 minutes, and this will be followed by an open discussion and questions. And I'll introduce all the speakers now. Our first speaker, Rebecca Bushnell, is Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, Thomas S. Gates Junior Professor, and Professor of English. She is also a true polymath, her first book being on Greek drama, Prophesying Tragedy, Simon Boyce and Sophocles' Theban Plays, and one of her most recent books being on early modern English gardening. She has also written Tragedies of Tyrants, Political Thought and Theatre in the English Renaissance, and, most relevantly for our topic today, A Culture of Teaching, Early Modern Humanism in Theory and Practice. She has received an ACLS Research Fellowship and the Lindback Award for Distinguished Teaching, as well as an NEH grant for teaching with technology, which she used to create with Michael Ryan a world-famous internet site. It's absolutely spectacular. If you don't know it, you should know it. It's called ERIC, the English Renaissance in Context, which includes superb online tutorials on printing. It's the best way to learn how printers work. It's actually from the 18th century, so it's a cheat in that sense because it's called Renaissance in Context, but what you actually get is Diderot, and you can all these fabulous engravings, you can actually click on any part. It tells you what they do. It shows you can go through every element of printing. It's spectacular. It includes superb online tutorials on printing, editing, how to make sense of the material features of the early modern world, and Shakespeare's plays. Our second speaker, Peter Conn, is Professor of English at Penn. His awards include fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the NEH, and both the Lindback Award and the Ira Abrams Award for his outstanding teaching. He is the author of The Divided Mind, Ideology and Imagination in America, 1898 to 1917, Literature in America, a one-volume history of American literature, Pearl S. Buck, A Cultural Biography, and he edited the teaching edition of Franklin's autobiography that was published this year by the University of Pennsylvania Press. He has served as a graduate chair of English and American Civilization, as Dean of the College, as Ombudsman, and as Provost of the University. Our third speaker, Michael Zuckerman, is Professor of History at Penn, but he was trained in American Studies, first year at Penn as an undergraduate, and then as a graduate at Harvard, that well-known college where students learn how to carry themselves handsomely and enter a room of gentility, which might as well be acquired at a dancing school. He is an expert on Franklin, about whom he has talked on radio and TV. He's also been a consultant to many programs. His books include Peaceable Kingdoms, New England Towns in the 18th Century, Almost Chosen People, Oblique Biographies in the American Grain, and edited volumes on Friends and Neighbours, Group Life in America's First Plural Society, and Beyond the Century of the Child, Cultural History and Developmental Psychology. This last collection relates to a collaborative project between historians and developmental psychologists to write a history of childhood from the Middle Ages to the new millennium. And I'll say a few words at the end before opening up the discussion. So first of all, Rebecca.
So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to start with a confession, which is that, in fact, in my years here as a university administrator, I've said some unkind things about Ben Franklin. In fact, when I became dean of the college 3 years ago, one of my first official acts was to declare a one-year moratorium on references to Ben Franklin in any decanal speech or publication. I said, it is time to give it a rest. Now, what would have provoked such a lack of reverence on my part? Was I not a true daughter of Pennsylvania? Well, here was what was making me impatient. At almost every speech and event, either welcoming students here or ushering them out, people would cite the following passage from the 1749 proposal relating to the education of youth in Pennsylvania. And as to their studies, it would be well that they be taught everything that is useful and everything that is ornamental. But art is long and their time is short. It is therefore proposed that they learn those things that are likely to be most useful and most ornamental, regard being had to the several professions for which they are intended. Now, you're probably going to prod me, well, Rebecca, what's the matter with that? Isn't that the brilliance of Franklin's vision, in defiance of the tired and irrelevant education of the time which dwelled in the musty realms of the Latin and Greek classics? Franklin's school was to be different. It was to be, to use our own tired word, relevant. Dare I say, using his own words, it apparently was supposed to be pre-professional. Although I would point out that profession in Franklin's time is something rather different than it was today. So what didn't I like? As a professor of English and comparative literature, you can see that I was probably asking, did this mean that a Penn education was only really meant to be instrumental, professional? No, you're going to reply. You say, look, he says students should learn those things that are likely to be most useful and most ornamental. But what are these things? After all, what is useful? What's ornamental? So what do we think Franklin meant? Now, perhaps I reacted with some fear and anxiety because I feared that the things that I teach, early modern English literature and culture, are seen by most people as to be all too ornamental. Oh yes, beautiful. As ornamental is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary, ornamental means adding beauty and attractiveness, decorative as opposed to merely functional. But there also, I think, is an implicit hierarchy in the useful and the ornamental. As the OED goes on to point out, the ornamental is also that which is decorative but non-essential. So if the ornamental is the non-essential, you can imagine which is the first to go when the budget cuts come. So, who decides what's useful and what's ornamental? And is the opposition equal, or in fact is there an implicit hierarchy and rank order in that? So, in preparation for giving these remarks, I decided to give Franklin a chance. So I returned to the proposal, going on a fabulous online website where the proposal is, to puzzle out what he might have meant when he spoke of the useful and the ornamental. And not surprisingly, it was much more complicated than I thought, although the complication, interestingly enough, is in those extensive footnotes to the text. I mean, the text itself is telegraphic, not that interesting. The footnotes are unbelievable. I found, when I read it, that the text of the proposal is imbued with the language of profit and delight, which is key to humanist poetics and educational reform from the 16th century on in the Anglo-Saxon world. The humanist works of education, again, that I became very familiar with in working in the book that, actually working on the garden stuff too, they emphasize the importance of pleasure as well as discipline and utility in learning, primarily because they recognize that a student's more likely to study and remember that what is attractive than that what is forced on them. In his defense of poesy, Sir Philip Sidney praised the poet, in fact, as a better teacher than the philosopher or the historian. because he claimed that of all the humane sciences, the poet is the monarch, where he does not only show the way, he gives sort of sweet a prospect into the way, as will entice any man to enter into it. So let's look at how Franklin dealt with profit and pleasure, or use and beauty. Now, it's clear that the study of history anchors the curriculum of his proposed academy. For as he says, and I quote a rather long quote here, history is to be made a constant part of their reading, such as the translations of the Greek and Roman historians and the modern histories of ancient Greek and Rome, etc. And may not almost all kinds of useful knowledge be that way introduced to advantage and with pleasure to the student. History, that is certainly useful, but it's also pleasure, a pleasure that draws you to what is useful. At the same time, I found out, history also teaches about the usefulness of beauty itself, in showing, for example, the wonderful effects of oratory. For in reading history, he says, students may be acquainted with the best models among the ancients, their beauties being particularly pointed out to them. Now, you may say, well, of course you're going to see this combination of the useful and the ornamental in the study of history. What I found is that natural history, or science, also appears in Franklin's curriculum as connecting beauty and utility. So in the notes to the text, Franklin quotes Rawlins advocating the reading of the best histories of nature. This is science is the histories of nature, which he said would not only be delightful to use and furnish them with great matters for their letters, etc., as well as other history, but afterwards be great use to them, whether they are merchants, handicrafts, or divines. So science, it seems, may be useful to people when they grow up, when they go into their professions, but it's also delightful when it gives you something to write letters about, to write about in your letters. Reading science, I also found, also helps a person to adorn his discourses by beautiful comparisons and strengthen them by new proofs of divine providence. This is sort of intelligent design in a different form. Finally, it appears, he says, the conversation of all will be improved by it, by the reading and study of science, as occasions occur frequently of making natural observations, which are instructive, agreeable, and entertaining in almost all companies. I mean, I read this in short to say science is really good for small talk at parties. So he says, in the end, the text concludes, instead of being painful and tedious, natural history is pleasant and agreeable. It may be used as a recreation and should usually be made a diversion. Now, I have to say, this all sounds pretty damn ornamental to me. So my point here, I think, if you want to step back, and obviously it's not to say all the things that you said about, science and the importance of science and the utility of science, but what I think Franklin recognized was the sheer beauty of the study of the natural world, and that it was actually ornamental in the most, fundamentally celebratory way. Now, what about my own line of work? Okay, let's go to the study of English literature. Now, it turns out it's really useful because it involves the study of language. Now, again, Franklin's proposal notoriously advocates the primacy of the study of English over Latin, something put actually quite casually in the text of the proposal itself, but it's dealt with quite elaborately in the notes. Reading and writing English is at the core, again, of his vision of this new curriculum. English and arithmetic, he says, are necessary, while the understanding of Latin and Greek are, in his words, a distinguishing ornament. In the text, in the notes, he declares, the English language may be taught by grammar, in which some of our best writers, as Tillotson, Addison, Pope, Algernon, Sidney, Capo's letters, etc., should be classics. The style principally to be cultivated, being clear and concise. Reading should also be taught in pronouncing properly, distinctively, emphatically. To form their style, they should be put on writing letters to each other, making abstracts of what they read, or writing the same things in their own word, telling or writing stories lately read in their own expressions. So reading literature and writing thus entails an apprehension and the expression of beauty and of the ornamental, but it is also the foundation of all of these of study. So what have I learned from my reading of Franklin on that fabulous website? I think that the modern University of Pennsylvania fails Franklin. It will do so if we assume we can easily distinguish what is useful from what is ornamental. perhaps I was wrong in my irritation and Franklin's proposal that we should teach everything that is useful and everything that is ornamental, but art being long and time is short, it is therefore proposed that they learn those things that are likely to be most useful and most ornamental. Read carefully. The text suggests that the and in the second sentence is truly a conjugation, joining the useful and ornamental things divided, I think, in the prior sentence, and thus embracing the ornamental qualities of mathematics and physics and the great utility of Alexander Pope. I think the future of this extraordinary university lies in our ability to transcend the relentlessly utilitarian bent of our own society, which thinks it knows what's useful. Okay, making money, carrying expenses, and useful alone. Instead, let us try to sustain the potential, I think, that's really inherent in Franklin's proposal, a kind of visionary pragmatism that understands the transformative power of art, the beauty of natural phenomena, and above all, the pursuit of truths that matter.
I'd like to start, by personally re-congratulating Tal and Gina and the board. That presentation was superb, not just the essay, but you have skills that I'm still trying to acquire, and I plan to get your email address. For many years, as some of you know, and many of you don't, I've played a peculiar role at Penn. I'm the guy that people regret after 10 minutes that they invited to the party. And that's, I'm afraid, going to be a little bit true today. So you'll see why. I start with the last three sentences. Peter referred to this book, which some of you have seen. This is the edition we cobbled together for the Penn Reading Project this past September, the edition of Franklin's autobiography. And it has in it, I think, quite wonderful essays by several of our faculty colleagues, one of them by Mike Zuckerman, who's going to be speaking in just a moment. And if you know his work, what I will call a typically brilliant and challenging essay, Mike ends by saying this of Franklin. I'm going to be applying what Mike says to a different terrain than my work, but nonetheless. Mike ends by saying, perhaps like the prophets of old, Franklin forecast the future. He never himself knew it, and if he had, it would have disheartened him. We invoke Franklin's legacy with unremitting regularity. I never called a hiatus of the year or even a month. I've talked about Franklin more often probably than about my children. Today, I want to enter just a tiny dissenting opinion and suggest that we are too glib in appropriating Franklin and his example and his vision. In fact, in many respects, some of them quite substantial, we have departed from Franklin's precepts and principles for better, but I think more often for worse. I have brought 6 examples with me, but will restrict myself to the first 3. I'll be relieved to learn, given the pressure of time, though I have the other 3 in my file folder. First, theory and practice to the point of self-hypnosis. To quote my 5-year-old grandson Zachary, theory schmeary. If you take Franklin seriously, it's quite clear that curing the divide between theory and practice was in the end incidental and instrumental. It was a means to an end. The purpose of education, in Franklin's view, was to prepare young people for citizenship. I would submit that neither Penn nor most of America's colleges take that charge very seriously. Except in pockets of this university, the call to civic education is merely an unavoidable convocation and commencement cliche. I've added my share of bloviation to that list of tiresome rhetoric myself. It plays almost no role in our curricular designs, in our individual courses, in our collective life. We have not even made much effort to think through what such a commitment would really mean. It would not be simple. It would be heavily laden with opportunities for fraud, and would almost certainly require immense subtlety even to orchestrate the discussion. But it would be a discussion well worth having. Eric Bach, who in this text I had typed once president of Harvard. Now I revived that. Derek Bach, once and future president of Harvard. Last year or the year before, quite recently published an important book, Universities in the Marketplace. Among many other needful observations, Bach says that, and I quote, arts and sciences faculties currently display scant interest in preparing undergraduates to be democratic citizens, the task once regarded as the principal purpose of a liberal education and one urgently needed at this moment in the United States, end quote. Two, and perhaps related to one. Franklin had a particular concern for the least well-off members of society. The hospital which he helped Dr. Bond to establish in the 1750s had the care of the poor as its explicit mission, something in which I think he could take particular pride. And the academy, which whose founding Chris referred to, the technical reason we can trace our foundation to 1740, even though it's explicitly in the board trustee minutes of the 1880s that we wanted to have been founded earlier than Princeton. That was explicitly stated. The reason we can do that legally is that we are entitled under the laws of the Commonwealth to claim our foundation to the earliest charter we hold, and we hold the Academy Charter. The Academy, to which Penn proudly points as its own founding event, was originally intended for the education of poor boys. Franklin exemplified upward mobility, and he wanted to enable it. But as we all know, upmarket universities, including this one, have essentially become mechanisms for the maintenance of the socioeconomic status quo. A widely circulated recent study indicated that students from genuinely needy backgrounds number under 10% at Penn and similar institutions. This is a complex subject, and I don't want to address it in a simplifying or moralizing way. But it is simply the case that family income is the best predictor of academic success. Using universities as their principal vehicle, the upper class and upper middle class replicate themselves, this at a time when much current research suggests that economic divides are becoming less rather than more permeable. Here's an irony from last month's Chronicle of Higher Education. Quote, students from wealthy families received much more financial aid from private colleges and universities in 2000 than they did 7 years earlier, according to this policy paper. The aid offered to students from low-income families, meanwhile, remains stagnant. 3, and finally, the quality of undergraduate education. I start with a chart that you don't have, but I do, right here, which I will now summarize, which appeared in the article I'm going to refer to. An article by Andrew Hacker, the sociologist, in the New York Review of Books a year or two back. What this chart did was to summarize the results of a survey conducted by the Princeton Review of 110,000 undergraduates at 357 colleges. And it asked a whole set of questions, but the question that is isolated in this chart that I'm going to summarize in a moment asked students to report to Princeton Review through the survey on whether their, quote, professors brought the material to life. You can scant the importance of a data set such as this, but here's what it said. The high scorers were Reed, Carleton, Middlebury, and Amherst, all at 98% and above. The bottom of the barrel was occupied by UCLA, Texas, Michigan, Harvard, and Penn. Let me put the issue in the form of a question, what scientists sometimes call a thought experiment. Is it really out of a deep commitment to the highest quality of undergraduate education that we at Penn and similar universities warehouse our first-year students in a sequence of large lecture classes and turn over the bulk of responsibility for their education to professors at the front of large assembly rooms, assisted by TAs and adjunct teachers? Would that really be the outcome of a design project intended to deliver the very best teaching and learning? Or does it suit our needs, financially in generating large tuition revenue to pay increasingly high administrative and even faculty salaries, and professionally to protect the most senior faculty from the most junior students? A colleague of ours, Bob Zemsky, from the School of Education, has described the modern faculty as a collection of independent contractors, each of us making our own best deal in the market. The legendary Harvard Dean, Henry Rosofsky, said much the same thing in a report to his faculty 15 years ago. According to Rosovsky, the faculty, quote, had become a society largely without rules. Or to put it slightly differently, the tenured members of the faculty, frequently as individuals, make their own rules on virtually every subject, from teaching to consulting to advising. Hint, most of us stopped doing it. Contact with students outside of class. So 3 issues: citizenship, equity of access, quality of educational effort, on which we would do well to grapple with sober determination before declaring too loudly our proud descent from Ben Franklin.
This can get to be a bummer. I feel like I wanted to do everything that Peter did. And if I really wanted to save your time, I would go back and sit down. But I did want to congratulate Tal. I have been doing this Franklin circuit since September, maybe earlier, once a week, once every 2 weeks. That's the longest that elapses before I get into this. And the stuff that you heard from Tal is the first original stuff I've heard in 5 months. Beyond that, I think the only thing that I want to do differently than Peter is not so much talk at you as ask you, and pose a few questions that really have to do with how far we can follow Franklin and how far we would really want to follow Franklin even if we could. First, Franklin envisioned a school that would be radically unlike any other, not just in the colonies, but anywhere else in the world. His imagination of an academy was set exactly against the educational establishment of his day. He saw things that needed to be done that the establishment neither saw nor did. But Penn, in 2006, is part of the establishment. And I think the question that we would probably need to confront if we were honestly going to deal with Franklin was what reason there would be to think that in 2006 Penn would want to, or could, even if it wanted to, be remotely as radical, as innovative, and as inventive as Franklin meant his academy to be. That seems to be off the table at this point. Another question. Franklin proposed that his academy constantly inculcate and cultivate a benignity of mind, which would show itself in searching for and seizing every opportunity to serve and to oblige. He held that the idea of what is true merit should be often presented to youth and impressed on their minds as consisting in an inclination joined with an ability to serve mankind. I would have you ask whether Penn could exist if that really were his primary purpose, as it was Franklin's, to teach such benevolence. Would parents pay the tuition for kids to be taught benevolence, to be taught goodness, to be taught kindness, to be taught to do good rather than to do well? And do you really need a college for that? Why wouldn't parents teach their kids that in the first place? The third question. Franklin did actually practice what he preached. He did give himself almost utterly to the public, to the point that lots of scholars have actually wondered whether he had any inner self at all. His avatar of individualism seems to have scarcely been an individual. One very splendid scholar wondered whether Franklin might not have been the only human in history without an unconscious. But truly, life for Franklin was exactly about the arrangement of his public poses, the management of his masks, which he saw as both a pleasure and a necessity. And I would ask, is that our idea of how to live? Franklin endlessly accommodated the claims of others. He explicitly trained himself. We've got in the autobiography an extended and recurrent account of how he taught himself not to assert or express himself in his own ideas and desires. He was the consummate master of fronts and facades. He cared scarcely at all for authenticity or integrity. And again, I would ask, is that the way we live? I think things have changed since. And one final question along the same line. Talk about party. Our president, Amy Gutman, has proposed that Penn move from excellence to eminence. I would suggest that that proposal is profoundly Franklinian. She really has embraced the spirit of Franklin with that proposal. But I'd ask you if that's the way you think we should go. Excellence is intrinsic. It's what you actually are. Eminence is how you stand. It's what others think you are, what your image is. Do you think that life is about moving from a focus on real worth to an emphasis on how others see you? An obsession with the U.S. News rankings, and the derivation of your sense of worth from whether you can stay number 4? Finally, I do want to talk actually instead of ask you in one last little bit, because I think we ought to be clear that the statute of limitations has expired. Even Franklin would say so in his will. Franklin provided that the money that he was leaving to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Boston, and Massachusetts, 4 separate gifts, all identical, was to be used in a certain way, which would derive a certain amount of income. At 100 years, the income was to be used in a particular way and go on for the next 100 years. And then he released his beneficiaries. And he said, at 200 years, even I don't profess to think the future should go. And it seems to me that by now, we're well past even the 200 years that Franklin said would outrun the reach of his brilliance and his design. And it seems to me that there's simply no need for us any longer to hold ourselves responsible to Franklin's design from a quarter millennium ago.
Well, I'm not going to be a copy. Just a little bit, right? By the end of his life, Benjamin Franklin was naming himself in 2 quite different ways. On the one hand, he was Dr. Franklin, having received the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws in 1759 from the University of St Andrews in Scotland. On the other hand, he was, as he called himself in his final will and testament, Benjamin Franklin, Printer of Philadelphia. He was rightly proud of his academic accomplishments, but he was constantly aware that those accomplishments were founded on a single year at the age of 8, studying in a school that taught Latin, and another single year at a school that followed a non-classical curriculum. 2 years of formal education. And yet, when a Parisian scientist at the end of the 18th century thought of the 3 gods of science, they were Galileo, Newton, and Benjamin Franklin. Franklin resented his lack of formal education, but he also knew that he had had a superb education as an apprentice and then as a journeyman printer. In the printing houses of Boston, Philadelphia, and London, he read everything he could get his hands on, from Defoe's novels, to Cocker on arithmetic, to Sulla on practical navigation, to Arnaud and Nicole on logic or the art of thinking. but he equally learned the extent to which knowledge is produced through the hand. As a printer, he made ink. He made and restored presses. He replaced worn-out type with type that he had made himself, and in his old age, he invented new typefaces. He made woodcuts and engravings, and indeed he made the first engraving press in the Middle Colonies. He was his own compositor, pressman, warehouseman, and a bookseller and accountant. And he was at the center of a burgeoning American trade in papermaking, which has been He was at the center of a burgeoning American trade in papermaking, which had first been established in America, here in Philadelphia, by William Rittenhouse at the end of the 17th century. Without paper, we wouldn't have had the material basis on which most of our knowledge until the computer was founded, and on which, in fact, is still the basis of most of our knowledge. There's a wonderful book that's come out called The Myth of the Paperless Office. It used to be believed that paper would somehow become a necessary agent of the computer, and it's been discovered exactly the opposite. There's been an increase. And many of us know this. You go through endless drafts now. You make a draft, and you print it out, you make another draft. And so, for this very paper, I think this is, I can't say how much paper I wasted. But a huge amount. For Franklin, then, knowledge was gained through the interaction between hand and brain, not through either one alone. When he became a scientist, he made many of the pieces of equipment that he needed for himself, and he transformed old equipment. So at one level, and this is my little bit of party pooping, Franklin would, I think, have been disappointed, not only by Penn, but by the whole system of education, which locates so many of the manual skills in primary schools and so many of the mental skills in higher education, with the result that we produce English students and professors who know how to read a book, but not how a book is made, and architectural students and professors who know how to draw plans, but have little knowledge of bricklaying or carpentry. Franklin experienced the division of labour firsthand. American printers both composed the type and did the press work. In England, where Franklin worked as a journeyman printer, compositors and pressmen were separate people. But whatever the advantages of a division of labour, it was, Franklin believed, damaging whenever it privileged abstract knowledge over practical know-how. When Franklin called himself Dr. Franklin, he was recalling, among other things, that he had a superb education here in Philadelphia, reading the books of the Quaker merchant, James Logan. Logan allowed Franklin a free range in his library. And what a library it was. It included books in Latin, Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew. Logan, who like Franklin himself had never had a university education, was a great Hebraist. Logan's notebook of Hebrew words that he had difficulty with survives, and remarkably is made up almost entirely of words whose meaning is still disputed. Logan also owned the first edition of Newton's Principia Mathematica, and his copy includes corrections that he made to Newton's great book. Correct corrections. Logan's books are the books that one would expect to find in the library of a distinguished scholar and gentleman in London, a man of leisure who belonged to the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Arts, not in the library of a merchant in a small colonial town. Logan's books are now in the Library Company of Philadelphia, the lending library that Franklin and a group of young artisans set up, a library filled with a wide range of practical and impractical books in English. These are the books that one would have found impossible to find in any lending library in any country prior to the foundation of the Library Company here in Philadelphia. They include practical books on penmanship, on how to fill out legal forms, gardening books, herbals, and here's some titles for you which I like: The British Carpenter, or a treatise on carpentry, a general history of printing, a complete history of drugs, a tutor to astronomy and geography, Dialing Universal. I love that. Dialing Universal. It's a telephone already. I have no idea what it's about. This is what it says it's about. Dialing Universal, and I have confessed I've not read it yet, but I intend to read it. Or, quote, how to describe the hour lines upon all sorts of planes in any latitude whatever. And so, Eduardo maybe will explain this to us. How to describe the our minds upon all sorts of planes in any latitude, whatever, and I'm sure it's very useful. The practice of perspective, reasons for establishing a colony in Georgia, a new method of chemistry, the universal traveller, and one book, Antiquity Explained. And then shipbuilding, Unveiled, the horse-hoeing husbandry, or an essay on the principles of tillage and vegetation, a collection of maps, the Gardener's Dictionary, Farriery Improved, instructions for the education of a daughter. This was a library made by and designed for artisans, some of whom were also training themselves to read the kinds of scholarly books that one found in Logan's library. But Franklin never left behind the library company, graduating upwards, as it would be imagined in his own day, to the greater prestige of Logan's books. The fact that in 1792 Logan's library was folded into a library established by artisans is entirely fitting. In his 70s, Benjamin Franklin, world-renowned scientist and philosopher, set up a foundry on his estate outside Paris to cast type so that he could print with his own hands and with the help of his grandsons the passports, the loan certificates, the promissory notes, and all the other printed forms that a new nation required. As he did so, he was transmitting to his grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, the manual skills that he himself had learned as a child. To his dying day, Dr. Franklin remained Benjamin Franklin Printer, a man who never turned his back on the artisanal knowledges that a gentleman with soft hands could never acquire. And Benjamin Franklin Printer remained Dr. Franklin, a man with the endless curiosity to explore new political, scientific, and literary ideas. That's why Franklin would have been so delighted that Tal Raviv, a student in engineering and applied sciences, would have been the winner of today's award for a literary essay.
I'll make a guess that the dial refers to a sundial, obviously trying to figure out where to make the shadow work.
Right. Thank you. You should go read the book then. Tell us the rest of your findings.
Yeah. I was curious, Franklin is credited with the founding of the University of Pennsylvania, the Library Company, a few other, other major institutions around the area, Philadelphia area.
Hospitals,
exactly. Yeah. But I heard somewhere along the line, and I just want you to expand on this, that he actually was co-founder, or he founded with people. He wasn't exactly, in other words, and the people are they lost to history, or?
Well, the truth of the matter is that this is our way of dealing with Franklin as we become more self-sufficient, more individualistic than anybody could ever be in the 18th century or in the 19th century. And we now have banks, we have hospitals, we have roofing companies and home building companies. We can all by ourselves put a roof up if we're building a house. We can all by ourselves provide medical care by just paying the money or having the insurance or whatever. You wanted a roof on your house, you wanted your crop brought in the 18th century, you had to have other people. And you wanted medical care, you had to have good relations with the midwives or the doctors and the messengers who would run and get them in the dark of night when suddenly you had an emergency and they had to be willing to come. And you couldn't dream of being an individual in the 18th century in ways that we can now when there are banks and so forth. So Franklin simply lived in a world where the participation of others and the aggregation of others was inevitable. There was no other way to think. But Franklin is the guy who actually almost the one thing he did single-handedly was create the voluntary associational form, which is how we live. but we've lived ever since. And all you got to do is pick up a newspaper and look at any page of it, and it's just pervaded by all the organized groups that we have. So Franklin never did any of these things by himself, wouldn't have dreamed of doing any of these things by himself, because that was exactly contrary to what he was actually accomplishing, which was to find a bunch of people concerned to have a hospital, concerned to have a fire company, concerned to have an insurance company, or whatever it might have been. Besides which, Franklin was simply never rich enough to have pulled any of these things off, even if he had thought of them, had invented them. And he talks about never putting himself at the front of any of these, because it's the same way that you're going to run a development campaign. You need donors and people with serious money to warrant the prospects of this thing, and then the little guys can fall in place behind. So Franklin always had to have some flagship out there, some truly rich merchant, or a few truly rich people, gentlemen or whatever. In his more cunning aspects, he also knew that this was a jealous democracy, and that people are not very thrilled to watch others getting too high up and lording it over them. So, as best he could, he made sure never to stand in front, because that was the vulnerable place. That was the place that they loved to cut you down a peg or see you take a fall. In his wildest dreams, the guy that he put out front would claim the credit for it. And then all the locals who knew that it was Franklin's idea could say, that's not Pemberton's, that's Franklin. In which case, the democracy would get its drops off in terms of cutting somebody down to size, and Franklin would get the credit without paying the price of having been the late guy. That was when the wildest dreams came.
Thank you.
Can you briefly tell us something about the two essays written by the young ladies?
Yes, we did. They should stand up. You want to say something about your essay? We'd like to talk about your essay.
I guess evaluated to what extent Penn as an experience met Franklin's expectations initially, talking about sort of education as in relation to his secret society, the Junto, and my sort of experience at Penn.
We'll aim to put them all up on the website.
Okay.
Do you want to say how to take a look at that?
Sure. I basically examined different aspects of Franklin's virtues that he enumerated in all of his works, or many of his works, and I applied them to today's life at Penn, how we are fulfilling those virtues. And also, I had written that I was very pleased to see how Franklin used so much wit and satire in his writing, which is something that I do a lot of as well. So I've tried to put a satirical spin on a lot of his virtues and how they apply today.
I have been in the undergraduate dorms on Saturday night, so how did you think we stack up against Franklin's virtuous silence? or order, or temperance?
I spoke about that in my essay in regard to the fact that in education, the proposals of youth in Pennsylvania, Franklin, imagined that all the students would sort of live together, that they would be integrated within the community, that they would be integrated within the community and with each other. And I think that that Penn doesn't make the accommodations very accommodating, and that I said that either students are sort of stacked in these tall, sort of leaning, or else you have an experience like where I moved off campus and I explained that I moved every single semester since, and you sort of you're at the will of these like really ungracious landlords, and it's really like uncomfortably divided and strangely it's really poorly thought out. Victorian homes, and so I described having waking up in the morning to sort of like this homeless man battering a air conditioner outside of my window for no reason, or kids like partying all night long, and it just didn't seem to really go with Franklin's sort of vision of everyone kind of cohabiting.
I should also mention that I actually included the quote that Dean Bushnell put into her speech. And now I feel terribly cliche. I don't know if she knew that, but she does. But they're on the website. You can see my interpretation of that quote.
The freewheeling independence of academia, we jeopardize Penn's curriculum. Not curriculum, but its standing in terms of being able to, with the standards that are set out by the certifying agencies that dictate what it's, the credentials of the school and its ability to give out degrees and stuff. I think if you went away from the academic, or academia, I should say, you wouldn't be able to operate as a university.
I think that's probably true. But I said I wasn't being specific about my own remarks. I wasn't being specific about Penn. I was thinking actually about a total organization of the way in which we relate. I mean, to give an example, there's a whole range of things that we need, in my view, right here at Penn. I'll give one example. Here in the library, we don't really have a bindery. So it means when books fall apart, we don't really have people. We have to farm out most of that. If you go to the library company, they've got a great bindery. Now, a great bindery is not just repairing books, it's people with know-how who can teach students. They can teach everybody. I have learned so much from that bindery at the library company. These are people who are hands-on with them. You understand what a book is in a way you never do otherwise. And one of the things we're trying to do at the moment is to try to develop fellowships whereby students can go into the town, this great town, Philadelphia, with many great institutions. Penn's only one of these institutions, huge range of institutions there with real knowledges, and those are the kinds of areas where there can be exchanges, very practical kinds of know-how. And I myself am working with a man who left school at 16 to become a binder down at the Forge of Shakespeare Library. We're actually working on a race-ball paper. He's making a race-ball paper that was made in the Renaissance, that was first made in 1500. And these are the kinds of knowledge exchange. So I learn more about Hamlet because Hamlet talks about these are race-ball papers, literally. And so the lies, and so that's how I got interested by this. But I need this man's skills. Mm-hmm. And as I say, left school at 16, but no one knows a book the way he knows a book. No one. And the people at the one of the head woman of the bindery here was actually trained under him with the library company. Trained under him. So these exchanges of knowledge, I think these have been. I think the hierarchy of knowledge is all wrong. That says that you have a sort of bottom level of where people work with their hands, and then you sort of somehow. We need both, and that's what Franklin, I think, was understood.
Can I ask this something about this, which is actually also to Peter? All right, because I think you gave an awfully dark vision of, in fact, particularly the theory and practice ideal, which I do think, at heart, I really do believe that sustains the heart of what we think of as education at the University of Pennsylvania. And I can cite a lot of examples. Now, you may want to counter me, but, for example, academic good-based community service, which we know, you and I know, we have a very strong program in academic good-based community service. I think I can cite an example of the ICA seminar, where we have students who are studying contemporary art, but they're also learning how to curate an exhibition, and putting again what they've learned in everything. If you could think that what could be more ornamental than contemporary art, but they're also have a seminar in which they learn how to put together the pieces and explain and work with the budget to mount an exhibition. So, and I was thinking as we were speaking that there are plenty of, I think, very strong examples at Penn where we, not in everything that we do, but we are trying to fulfill that concept of theory and practice.
You were offended.
I was offended. It's a pleasure.
I quoted from my grandson. Wise words were never uttered than my grandson. The distinction of, first of all, having been somewhat intimately involved in several of these activities, I said two things. One, there are pockets and places at this university where some of the issues that I think we ought to be addressing are addressed, but they are by no means the majority of the places. And secondly, my point was explicitly that theory and practice, which I was simply not repudiating, was a means to the end of educating youth for democratic citizenship. Mm-hmm. And without that, to talk about we do that one over there and we do that one over there without having a collective conversation about what it is we're doing and why, simply leaves us where we always are, which is in the marvelous and exhilarating condition of having a curriculum hostage to the individual intellectual entrepreneurship of 2,400 individual brilliant people. That's a very exciting place to be, and it leaves me with no responsibilities whatever in educating students beyond whatever it is I think they ought to know. But so it wasn't an attack on theory and practice, aside from boredom. It was an attempt to insert that into a conversation about the actual ends of democratic education in a democratic society. That's all.
Having said that we shouldn't follow Franklin, just a measure, a token of how really radical Franklin was along the lines that Peter was talking about. As he begins setting up his curriculum, 2/3 of which is history, but as he begins setting it up, the very first item that he wants taught is penmanship. The second item that he wants taught is drawing. The third item that he wants taught is perspective. This is all handwork. Later on, he says he wants him taught gardening and grafting and inoculating, and he says not just taught it, but he wants field trips out to good farms, plantations, he calls them, or fine farmers in the neighborhood. I imagine farmers in the neighborhood of the university now. But his notion was that it was only a couple of blocks to where the farms began, and he wanted them working in the soil. He wanted them, that was part of the curriculum. And we're talking about very different vision, things that are no longer on the table.
But still have relevance, in the sense that the penmanship thing is somewhere. This was actually probably was one of the greatest contributions, because it was the moment of a new kind of handwriting, the round hand, which had only just been developed fairly recently, which would sweep the world. And it's the basis now of all handwriting. So when you think of handwriting, it wasn't invented by Franklin, he's picking it up, but nonetheless, it's a development mainly through mercantile culture, just practice. It's because of navigation and people's merchants who are using this handwriting. It's legible. You can read Franklin's handwriting. Rebecca and I can tell you, we work in the 16th, 17th century. To try to understand any of his handwriting, you have to spend years doing paleography, really years. It's unbelievable. Just like everybody, they even invent their own alphabet, because you've got two different alphabets. You've got a secretary hand and an italic hand, and people use some letters from one. Everybody mixes up in their own way. It's incredible. And so, you have to take specialized courses through the thing from 1600. And so Franklin's part of this other world, which is a world that of clarity, it has real impact. It has teeth to it.
Well, and in fact, just a slightly arcane footnote, and also one that's probably only 60% accurate, and Mike will know about the other 40%. Either correct me or just let me go. But at a grander level, the argument has been made that Noah Webster's spelling book was possibly the most important engine of creating a national identity, and getting everybody to spell uniformly and not in the English manner. It was nationalistic and nation building.
Yeah, I have a question for Dr. Conn. One of the points that you had made was that Franklin had a considerable concern for the least well-off in society, and then that many of the institutions, like Penn included today, can continue to favor, possibly by circumstance maybe, I don't know, I won't make the judgment, but people of a higher socioeconomic standing. And Dr. Gutman has, of course, identified increasing access as an important one of three components of the compact. But to increase access, of course, we have to increase endowment. And to increase endowment, you have to go to people with money. And people with money have an interest in maintaining. Okay, I got your message.
You don't have
It's reconcilable.
Sorry. And actually, what that could have provoked me to, but it won't, and I'll spare you, is I said I had 6 of them. The fourth one, which is a little complicated and technical, is the theory of university endowments. Which is really a complicated and potentially very interesting subject that everybody takes for granted and shouldn't.
If you run really fast, you may get away from the explanation.
Mike said, what are we teaching? Are we teaching people benevolence? Now, that's sort of a good thing, because, benevolence, you say, well, then we teach them to be philanthropic, right? But the problem is, to be philanthropic, first you have to make the money. So you have something to give away. So it is this kind of interesting.
Yeah, but even if you make the money, the assumption is, of course, when you make a statement like that making the money, somehow that people just focus on making money. Some people really genuinely make money and do it for good reasons and unexpectedly, maybe, okay, and they might have the least advantaged in society at heart, and they come here and they make donations, right? And so then we, of course, promote these donations and talk about diversity and the value of diversity, and then you have a culture that's actually quite insular, and that culture might be concerned about some of the diversity. You might have a president like Dr. Gutman who says, diversity, regardless, that's what we're doing, that's a value, but not everyone really thinks it's a value. They think it's a value in theory, but not practice. This is a real, the development field, I'll tell you, this is reality here, and I'm thinking, well,
I know a little bit about the reality.
When you're dealing with people with money who have expectations set or otherwise, maybe they don't say it, that what happens with their money, and then ultimately they make an investment in the university, and so then the university, of course, has to be careful about not offending. I'm just wondering if there's a possibility that Dr. Gutman will succeed.
Is extremely important. Universities have to be careful not to be offensive. And university presidents have to be careful not to be offensive. And that was wonderful. The timing of that was spectacular. You made your speech. Of course, mine. Which is why so many university presidents keep their mouths shut on any possible subject that could offend anybody anywhere on the planet, especially anybody with money. Or the faculty of arts and sciences.
Yes, Franklin was a very curious fellow, and today curiosity seems to be waning. Do you see that a problem in universities and in America? I should say curiosity among Americans in many things seems to be waning. How do you address that in your various disciplines? And you think about that here at the university?
I would have no basis on which to accept the statement that curiosity is waning. I think we're surrounded by all kinds of inventive, curious, groundbreaking points. Sorry, it's rude. I'm pointing at Exhibit A. He's omnivorous.
He's a very curious fellow, but in general.
Curiosity about what, I guess, is the question. It's what, we always go back to the sense that we all seem to be extremely busy, and what are we doing? And I do think that the objects of curiosity, and the thing is, we have all this extraordinary technology now in this library. The access to knowledge we have now through the internet. It's just it's extraordinary, and people are spending a huge amount of time on the internet looking things up. Interestingly enough, but what? What is impelling, and then what is driving their curiosity? I think that there is a real question of how they're, particularly sort of the curiosity of the young. How is, the internet, TV, everything is how is it stimulating and directing that curiosity? And I think it's a very complex question. I think that it's not about Milton. Let's put it that way. Generally speaking, it's not about Milton. I may think that's a tragedy, but I think it's I think it really is something that it's not that they're. Our concern, our general concern is that what do people want to really know about? And do they want to know about Britney Spears? And they seem to have an inexhaustible appetite and curiosity about the trivial, I guess is what it is. I mean, maybe that's my anxiety and that's my old fuddy-duddiness, but there seems to be an inexhaustible curiosity about things that don't matter.
Bring these kids, man.
I think business is a great enemy of curiosity. I do think that's a problem. People get very busy. And one of the things that you see, I'd say across the university, as people get busier, they get narrower. You fall back upon your own discipline, your own little place in the discipline. And so I think that there's a sort of paradox that business is being encouraged by, all around us. We need to do more, we need to work harder. But actually what often happens is a narrowing as a result, and not actually having the time to be curious. And so, do things that maybe be wasteful. I mean, I think one of the things that's really crucial for Franklin is to know how to look for things that may not have any relevance. And it's this paradox. I mean, on the one hand, he's raising relevance, on the other hand, he's always goofing off. And, he's a great goofer offer. He plays chess a lot, but he works incredibly hard. But he really did work immensely hard. But he's not busy in that way. He's stimulating himself all the time.
The first half of your proposition seems to me to be indisputable, and Edmund Morgan, in his excellent book on Franklin a couple of years ago, makes the point in the preface. Franklin may have been the most inquisitive human being that ever lived. Morgan doesn't go that far, but I mean, it's just astonishing. Even when he was messing around, what he would tend to do is have an idea about how to play the chess game. This is an old man coming home sick from England on one of those 9-week voyages who sorts out the Gulf Stream. For a century. He was just, he took things apart. He put them back together. He was, as Peter says, with his hands all the time, the hand and the brain. And probably our systems of education have lost that connection between the hand and the brain, except for the keyboard on the computer. And it just fueled him, it energized him.
Ignorant question, but except for the fact that these other colleges that you mentioned were used mainly to train the clergy and had the curriculum to do that, and that the clergy and the church was thought of as the establishment. Was Franklin actually against religion? Did he really want to have an academy where religion would be debunked, or just one that different religions could be accommodated?
The second.
The second.
He clearly had no intent. My sense is,
was he religious?
My sense is that he hadn't a spiritual bone in his body. My sense is that religion was purely respectability for him. His early beliefs are closer to the Marquis de Sade God is simply an excuse to do whatever you want, since everything that you could do comes from God, because everything comes from God. So he's got the religious people hoist by their own petard. I think he's got some incredibly heterodox ideas. He's got transmigration of souls. He tells you that in this enormous universe, surely God is not going to be preoccupied with this little cinder in this little province of the universe. So if you want to pray to the sub-deity who's somewhere way down in the bureaucracy. But I think that he came to see in a host of that which he didn't believe in. And religion was one of those things that had enormous social prospects and possibilities. So he didn't want to purge the Academy of Religion. Stephen Girard, a few years later, is going to say with his great college, there cannot ever be a clergyman set foot on the property. That's the great Franklin. That's how antagonistic to religion the great philanthropist of the early 19th century in America was. Franklin is nothing like that. And the guy he chooses to be the provost of the academy, as the college, is himself an Anglican clergyman. The people on the board are Presbyterians or Anglicans, and he knows perfectly. He just doesn't want an established religion controlling the college. And it's that non-sectarian institution that he really can come.
He would never have said with Diderot, man will not be free until the last priest is strangled with the entrails of the last king.
Well, Dr. Zuckerman has the floor. I would like to hear more about this student dissatisfaction survey, where Penn and Harvard and others come in basically at the bottom. My question is that because those students demand more and expect more, or is it really an indication of an inherent problem with the way we run these institutions? And if it is there, I'd like to hear the panel discuss whether there's anything being done to deal with that right now.
Well, as seems to me almost always the case, the answer is both. I mean, I think it is the way we run this place. And I think it is that our students have higher expectations for what should be their education. I think these are incredibly thoughtful, creative kids, and they know that they're being underserved, particularly in the first couple of years when they're in these large lecture classes. The irony is that those large lecture classes are large, not because, I mean, in some cases, chemistry maybe, they're large because they're required for medical students, pre-med students, things like that. But most of them are large. In my department, the large ones are precisely because those are the faculty who can bring things alive. And so there's an inherent paradox in indicting the faculty for not bringing things alive when it's the ones who are best at it who inevitably attract the biggest followings and the best word of mouth. But yeah, I think it's some of both. So I think we're guilty, and we're exactly innocent.
The Peter survey what it's about is arranging colleges and universities, all the top ones are colleges. And the reason for that is about research. It's that, universities are set up, and it sets on, that's what Peter was getting at, is that faculty then are torn between how you get tenure, frankly, at a university is through research. It's not through teaching.
But closest
that's what people say.
Any power at this place, I proposed that we cut back by 3/4, half for some enormous amount the number of first and second year students in the place, and multiply by doubling the number of third and fourth year students. I think we stink at first and second year, and I think that we do superbly by the time the kids get to third and fourth year. But that's not going to happen because the way you build institutional loyalty that lets development officers tap into big money is by having it for 4 years.
But was the silence of the panel on that second question an answer that nobody's really in power that's dealing with this issue?
Seriously, I mean, this is, we take it very seriously. And there was, some of you in the room may know, I mean, certainly the college at Penn has gone through a very close study of its curriculum in the past, 5 to 6 years, through our curricular experiment called the pilot curriculum, where we actually had, in Franklinian, fashion, we ran a curricular experiment where we actually had a control group with a different curriculum and different sorts of courses to see if, how that affected student experience, satisfaction, learning, and have just recently, and I would say quite efficiently in comparison to other institutions, performed a curriculum reform and a review. And we work constantly at the, particularly in what we call general education. I mean, this thing that, in many ways, going back to some of the things that Tal was talking about, but talking about, interdisciplinary and integrative education, and in the first and second year. I think the challenge we have, this is the challenge that we've been talking about for quite a few years at Penn, which is particularly how to get it right for science education. When I was dean of the college, I actually went out and I spent some time sitting in those big science lectures to feel what it was like. And when I almost fell asleep in Chem 101, because I'd been up late the night before, and you can imagine what I thought the Daily Pennsylvanian, dean of college passes out. It's not just the photograph; it's the problem. But I learned for myself, what it is that I think one of the great challenges we have, not just for the future of this university, but for the future of this country, is to remake and revitalize science education. I mean, it is just, we are just losing too many people from because of that experience of the first, the big Chem 101 lecture. I mean, that is something, believe me, that we are taking very seriously and trying to find the right model that still, fits in the context of a believe it or not, University of Pennsylvania, we don't have infinite resources.
but take note that 2 out of the 3 prize winners here are from the sciences.
Yes, indeed. But then there's my beautiful English major, my student, who's nodding her head, exactly.
That's right. So something's going right. One mistake. I guess we've got time for one more question, and we'll have got a last question. No one's got a...
I was going to ask you, when's Harvard's next dance?
You're all warmly invited. One question about that.
It's not a question, it's a comment to the lady about donations. I'm quite active in raising money for the Penn Fund. They walk in at 7, 8 o'clock and they co-op alumni. And I got this woman who graduated from Penn College, 67, she's a professor in the Midwest. And of course, when a man calls up a woman at 7, 8 o'clock at night, he quickly have to identify who you are. I'm Alan Ford, I graduated from Penn just like you. And as soon as she says, I'm not going to give another penny to Penn until I pay off all these bills for divorcing that ex-Wharton School husband of mine. Wait, I didn't go to Wharton School. I went to college just like you. Oh, you did? We talked. We had a conversation, made a nice pledge.
We're invited to the 6th floor to see the exhibition up there and